the suggestion here is that Israel somehow is bordering on committing a genocide against the people of Gaza, which is absolutely not true. And in context, is such a dangerous claim for someone in Guterres' position to be making.
I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. Nothing can justify the deliberate killing, injuring, and kidnapping of civilians or the launching of rockets against civilian targets.
During an address to the United Nations Security Council that should have retained the tone that you just heard throughout, Secretary General Antonio Guterres demonstrated why the UN can't be counted on to keep the peace anywhere.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum.
Mr. Guterres' address more or less morphed into a justification for the Iran-backed invasion into southern Israel, which claimed the lives of more than 1,400 people.
The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished.
That comment is disgraceful to say, well, I mean, what happened to the Israelis was really terrible, but what they've done is also pretty bad. I mean, it is just completely tone deaf, and it's reality deaf, too, in a way that the world can't afford from a senior statesman like the UN Secretary General.
The grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
This, again, is completely out of touch with the reality on the ground, and also, frankly, borders into tropes that sometimes can represent anti-Semitism, because Hamas has an explicit strategy of trying to maximize Palestinian deaths by using Gazan civilians as human shields, precisely for the purpose of embarrassing Israel and trying to deter Israel from defending itself.
What Mr. Guterres appears to forget is that it was a United Nations resolution passed in 1947 that recommended the partition plan for Palestine.
I call the first meeting of the Special Committee on Palestine to order.
It led to the creation of Israel the following year.
The UN owes a lot more to Israel in terms of defending the right of a UN member state just to exist. But the UN has also failed in its obligation to the Palestinian people because it continues to lock them into these refugee camps and to not find ways to work with Israel's neighbors in order to permanently resettle the refugees who should have benefited from that help 4 generations ago.
Following Israel's initial bombing campaign of Gaza after the October 7th attacks, Israel Defense Forces tried to warn civilians in Gaza to flee the likely path of an invasion.
Hamas terrorists are hiding in Gaza City, inside tunnels, underneath houses, and inside buildings populated with innocent Gazan civilians.
The protection of civilians is paramount in any armed conflict. Protecting civilians can never mean using them as human shields.
Civilians of Gaza City, evacuate south for your own safety and the safety of your families.
And the response from the UN Secretary General?
Protecting civilians does not mean ordering more than 1 million people to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, no food, no water, no medicine, and no fuel, and then continuing to bomb the south itself.
Guterres is playing into the terrorist strategy with these kinds of comments. While we're talking about everything that Israel shouldn't do to defend itself, where is the UN on issues like what should other neighbors in the region do to help innocent Gazan civilians?
I'm deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza.
Which is really the point. No one wants innocent Gazan civilians to die. Israel doesn't want that. The UN doesn't want that. Israel's friends and allies don't want that. The only people who want that are Hamas. And so the UN, instead of telling Israel what not to do, should be focused on encouraging other countries to take actions that can minimize the danger to civilians, whether that is accepting refugees into neighboring states, or whether it's putting more pressure on Hamas's patrons in Iran to cut the cord on this terrorist activity.